Hello. Today is Thursday of the second week of Advent. We have lit 2 Advent candles. We're continuing to read Bartholomew's passage, and today's chapter is titled Jericho. Did they see us? Bartholomew asked, hugging the boulder as if it could protect him from all bad things. I don't think so, Nathan answered. But Bartholomew wasn't so sure. He'd heard tales of Decca of Megiddo, one of which was that he had 4 pairs of eyes and knew everything that happened within a day's ride of himself. Bartholomew scrunched down even lower as the sound of the caravan drew closer. If a scout or a stray child happened to leave the road and come around the rock, they would surely see the 2 hidden travelers and raise an alarm. Bartholomew decided he'd rather be back at the skunk man's house than in the camp of Decca of Megiddo. Moments later, the caravan was just on the other side of the rock. Bartholomew could hear every footstep of every beast and person and could smell their smells as well. The dust in the air carried with it the stench of camel fur and donkey dung, of unwashed pots and 100 unwashed people. The smell made Bartholomew's stomach churn, while the noise battered his ears. He held his nose with one hand and plugged one ear with the other. Bartholomew could see the animals and people as they passed beyond his hiding place and followed the road around a hill below. At the front of the line was a man wearing a black cape that looked big enough to make a tent, but was just the right size for the man who wore it. Every look and move of the man seemed to say evil, and Bartholomew decided that this had to be Decca himself. He knew just by looking at the man that you could never escape if Decca got hold of you. The ground trembled with the passing of the caravan, and Bartholomew was sure that the train of people and animals would never end. But then, finally, the last person waddled by, a fat old woman with black teeth, and the long line of the caravan continued down the hill and around the corner. Nathan waited several minutes to be sure there were no stragglers, and then stood up and brushed himself off. As Bartholomew did the same, Nathan stared quizzically in the direction the caravan had gone. I wonder what Decca is doing down here, he mumbled under his breath. Bartholomew had many times heard the stories of Decca, how he raided and stole and tortured and killed. He came from the town of Megiddo at the north end of Bartholomew's province of Galilee, but until this day Bartholomew never had seen him. Decca seemed to stay away from the bigger towns, only terrorizing small defenseless villages. Well now, Nathan said, that was an adventure I do not care to repeat. Then turning to Bartholomew, he added, shall we continue our journey? Bartholomew thought that any distance they could put between them and Decca would be a good thing, so he nodded and picked up his bag. A few hours later, with the dust of the road filling his throat and the heat of the sun drying him out like a raisin, Bartholomew asked, Nathan, how much farther to Qumran? About a day, was Nathan's reply. Bartholomew's heart fell. This road was certainly easier than the one he'd been forced to tread to Caesarea, but except for that most unpleasant trip, he had never before been outside his own town of Jericho. All this walking was much too much work, he decided. But fear not, Nathan added. We shall soon find Jericho, where we will spend the night with a friend. Now Bartholomew's heart leaped with joy. He had heard of Jericho, of course, and his father and 2 oldest brothers had even gone there once, but he had never dreamed he would get to see the great city himself. As they walked, Bartholomew got around to asking the questions that had been bothering him all day. Nathan, he said, will the Messiah kill Cornelius when he comes? The Messiah will kill no one when he comes. Yes, he will. He will kill all those donkey Romans and give us back our land. No, Bartholomew, I'm afraid you are mistaken. It is true that many Jews believe that is why the Messiah is coming. But in truth, if you read the scriptures, you will find that he is coming to show us God's love, not his anger. Bartholomew squinted as he walked, his body acting out the conflict in his mind. But that's not what everyone always told me, he said. Everyone says the Messiah will come to kill the Romans. And what does the Torah say? Nathan asked quietly. I don't know, Bartholomew answered. I've only heard stories about Abraham and Noah and such. Which is why your father was teaching you to read, Nathan said, so that you can read the Torah for yourself and there find its truth. Bartholomew thought about this as he walked. He was starting to miss his father greatly again. But then he looked up and started to feel as if perhaps life could continue on after all, for out of the desert and next to a river that Bartholomew knew to be the Jordan, rose a city that to weary eyes looked as if it were made of gold. More objective eyes might have seen that the town was built of white mortar and stone, and that it was the glow of the setting sun that turned it to gold. But Bartholomew had no desire to be objective. It was a city almost as great as Caesarea itself, but better, because this was a Jewish city, not a Roman one. Bartholomew's eyes opened wide as he and Nathan entered the great trading port. The same traveling merchants he had seen in Caesarea seemed to be here, dressed in their colorful robes and turbans, and driving exotic animals. But there were no Romans among Jericho's citizens, and only a few soldiers to keep the peace. Bartholomew hoped that word of his escape had not traveled this far. Nathan walked on past the stalls where vendors of jewelry and pottery and strange-looking foods sold their wares, and then down a side street past an inn and a stable to a large wooden door, set in a wall with no markings on it at all. Nathan knocked, and a moment later the door was opened by a large man wearing a white tunic that made him look like a Roman. "Nathan!" the man cried with a hug and a smile. "My eyes expect a seller and instead see a friend." "And you are a sight that lightens the heart as well, my friend," Nathan responded. Turning to the boy beside him, he said, "Bartholomew, this is my good friend and troublemaker, Silas of Joppa. Silas, this is my new friend and companion, Bartholomew, a slave orphan, courtesy of the Romans." A cloud covered Silas's face, and he knelt his rather large bulk down to the boy. "My heart sobs with you at your loss," he said softly. "May my friendship help to fill the emptiness you feel." Without even thinking, Bartholomew hugged the man who moments before had been a stranger. He felt that perhaps his heart indeed was a little less empty. Silas stood and led the two travelers into his house, which Bartholomew thought looked as rich as the skunk man's, but much more friendly. "You'll first want a bath, no doubt," Silas said to Nathan. "It would ease my soul a bit," Nathan replied, and at that 2 servants were called to take Nathan and Bartholomew to a room with a large pool. As the setting sun shone on them through an archway, they soaked in the cool water. The servants brought new, fresh tunics, and then they joined Silas at a table set with a great feast, such as Bartholomew had seen at the skunk man's house. Only this time he got to sit down at the table. But then he was troubled. Looking at the servants, he whispered, "Are these men slaves?" Nathan smiled and whispered back, "No, my young friend, they are employees, well paid to serve us." With that, Bartholomew grinned and dove into the platters of food. So, what adventures did your latest journey bring? Silas asked of Nathan, as Bartholomew munched on the biggest duck leg he had ever seen. Oh, nothing out of the ordinary, Nathan said with a wink at Bartholomew. I traveled to Caesarea to talk more with Cornelius. Silas nodded at this as he ate, obviously knowing about the young Roman soldier. While I was there, I happened upon Bartholomew. He was attempting to convince some Romans that he didn't really care to have his hands chopped off. Silas stopped eating and looked at Nathan in disgust. Vestavian? He asked, referring to Bartholomew's former master. Nathan nodded, and Silas snorted and said, Someone should take that skunk out and chop off his hands, or worse. Bartholomew paused in the middle of chewing. Silas had used the exact word for Vestavian that he himself had used. He liked his new friend. But Nathan half smiled and half frowned. Now, Silas, he said, revenge is Jehovah's to hold, not for us to order. Yes, yes, I know, Silas answered, but sometimes a man is so evil that Jehovah needs a little help. Nathan kept looking at the wing he was chewing on as he said, You mean a man such as Decca of Megiddo? Silas stopped cold and stared. Did you see him? He gasped. Nathan nodded. Just this morning, his caravan traveled south towards Jerusalem. Silas turned several shades of purple and a couple of red before he was able to sputter the words, If the Messiah doesn't come soon to rid us of these demons, I swear I shall take a sword to them myself. Nathan sighed a deep sigh. You know, my friend, that the Messiah is not coming to kill our enemies for us. Silas took an angry bite out of the other duck leg. Yes, I know, he said sadly, but he should. Perhaps, was all that Nathan said. But Bartholomew could see thoughts to the contrary behind Nathan's eyes. With dinner over, Silas and Nathan talked a while. Then Silas announced it was time for sleep and led them all up some stairs, past torch-lit columns, and down a hallway. There he pointed out a room for Bartholomew and one for Nathan. Nathan must have seen the distress on Bartholomew's face at the thought of being alone. So he said, Why don't we move Bartholomew's sleeping mat into my room? And so that's what they did. And that's why it wasn't long before Bartholomew was lying snug on his mat, just a few feet from where Nathan lay on his. That's when Bartholomew asked, Nathan, when will the Messiah come? Soon, child, Nathan said with sleep in his voice. Very soon. Bartholomew was shocked at this, wondering how his friend could know such a thing. How soon? He asked through the darkness. Perhaps tomorrow, came the last words of Nathan for the day. Perhaps tomorrow. And any thought of sleep instantly left the 10-year-old's head. When will the Messiah come? When will Jesus return to gather up his flock and take them to heaven with him? Some people say that will happen any day, certainly in our lifetimes. Others believe and act as if it will not happen for thousands of years. Who's right and who's wrong? The truth is, we simply do not know. No one knows about that day or hour, Jesus said. But by the signs he gave us, the time could indeed be very close. Then again, the disciples thought the very same thing. They expected him to return soon after he ascended into heaven. I wonder if they would have acted differently had they known we'd still be waiting 2,000 years later. Bartholomew is beginning to understand that the coming of the Messiah is not some story being told that will have no impact on his life. He's beginning to understand that the prophecies are real and will change his life in dramatic ways. It is so easy for us to think of God as some vague and distant power, and to behave as if he doesn't matter at all. But the God we believe in and the Son whose advent we celebrate is the only thing that truly matters in our lives, not just because Jesus will return to earth someday, but because the Holy Spirit is already here. He's inside us, loving us and guiding us and comforting us. Imagine what this world would be like if everyone lived as if Jesus were returning to earth tomorrow.